And I would like to thank you for coming this morning. And it's sorry that we have to spend our Good Friday this way, but the terror situation in Europe is high on all of our minds this morning. And we thought we would assemble a panel of people who bring unparalleled experience and knowledge about this matter. So we'll be starting this morning with the Institute's own Matt Levitt. He is our Fromer-Wexler Fellow and Director of the Stein Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence. He was in Brussels last week, where he was meeting with Belgian government officials, federal police, intelligence services, and the local police in that famous neighborhood of Molenbeek. He is a former Treasury Department official, and he has also served in the State Department and the FBI. He'll be followed by Olivier Decottignies, who's a member of the French Foreign Ministry, who is a diplomat-in-residence here at the Washington Institute. And we want to emphasize that Olivier is speaking this morning in his private capacity as a visiting fellow at the Washington Institute. He is not speaking for the French Foreign Ministry or the French government. He joined the Institute last summer after serving for 3 years as a counselor at the French Embassy in Tehran, where he focused on Iran's nuclear and regional policies. Then our third speaker, Eric Rosand. The State Department's loss is our gain. He recently left the State Department, where he had served as counselor to the Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights. And previously, he was a senior official in the State Department's Bureau of Counterterrorism, where he spearheaded efforts to develop and launch the Global Counterterrorism Forum, among other institutions. And Eric has now joined the Prevention Project, which is organizing against violent extremism. So with that, let me turn the microphone over to Matt.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for turning out so early on a Friday morning. I wish it was for a more better topic, but here we are. Last week, I, as it happens, spent the week in Belgium meeting with Belgian intelligence and counterterrorism officials. As it happens, I was sitting with one of the chief Belgian counterterrorism officials on Tuesday as they were about to raid a safe house in the neighborhood of Forest. One person was killed in that raid. They did not find their primary target, Salah Abdeslam, but they did find his fingerprints. And 3 days later, just after I had left, they found him in the neighborhood in which he grew up, in Molenbeek, just around the corner from the family home. Let me just paint a picture for you. After meeting with the mayor and the police chiefs and the counter-radicalization cell and the civilian prevention officials in Molenbeek Municipal City Hall, I went with several of them for a walk around the neighborhood, which is not a denied space by any measure. It's a beautiful part of town. It's not like some of the neighborhoods, the banlieue in the suburbs of Paris. It's 15-minute walk from the EU city center, 3 or 4 metro stops away, including the one that was just targeted. And as we circled around back to the municipal building, we got to a picturesque, typical European cobblestone courtyard. On one side of that courtyard is the municipal building, and on the other side of the courtyard, catty-corner to it, with nothing but air between them, is the Abdeslam family home. Window to window, there is nothing but air between the municipality and the home of the family who was most wanted in Europe, but there's a world of difference between them. So I think there are 3 critical points that I took away from my time there, and now looking back on it after the Brussels bombings on Tuesday, that I want to share with you. The first is that authorities were absolutely aware of the threat, and they were doing all that they could. The problem is that Europe in general, and the Belgians in particular, have come late to this problem set. And this problem set is twofold. One is a traditional counterterrorism problem set, and the other, in some ways much more complicated, is one of social integration, social cohesion, integrating immigrant communities into society. When you have children in a neighborhood like Molenbeek who drop out of school at 11 or 12 and are heads of gangs by the time they're 18 and are not particularly religious at all, but are then drawn to an ideology that fills up many of the things they're missing in terms of family ties, mostly from broken homes, in terms of empowerment and belonging and having a purpose. Mind you, most of them aren't becoming particularly religious, but this is filling in gaps for them that have a lot less to do with traditional counterterrorism. Elsewhere in Europe, we certainly still see cases where radical Islam is the first piece of the component, but not here. From the counterterrorism perspective, there's a long way to go. And I'll give you just a few examples. Some of the most obvious are the fact that Salah Abdeslam was able to hide since the November attacks in Paris until this past Friday without being captured. Right? Many of the European Union member states are not yet electronically connected to the databases that Europol, to its credit, has already put in place at the border crossings. Europol has verified a minimum of 5,000 foreign terrorist fighters from the European Union who have gone to fight in Syria and Iraq. Some of them won't come back. Some of them will die there. Some of them have already come back. That 5,000 number, though, is not just from reporting from EU member states. In fact, much of it is not. According to the EU counterterrorism coordinator, who I met with last week, according to his latest report, the reporting from EU member states adds up to only a little over 2,700 verified foreign fighters, even though we know, and Europol has reported, at least 5,000. What's more disturbing still is that of the European Union member state reporting that has come in, over 90% of it is from only 5 members. There is critical need to fully integrate intelligence, information sharing, getting information where it needs to be. There's a long way to go there. At least as important is going to be dealing with the social integration piece in places like Molenbeek. As one official there put it to me, you are dealing with people who are going from zero to hero. People for whom this Islamic State ideology, the idea of getting in at the ground level and helping to create a caliphate, following in the footsteps of the Prophet Muhammad and his original followers, is extremely empowering. Almost every single one of the people that have carried out the recent set of attacks over the last 15 months has been someone that was on police radar for their criminal activity, without any knowledge whatsoever that they had been terrorists, and that's not the police fault. And the reason I say that is because in almost every case, the speed of radicalization has been at hyperspeed. Very, very quickly, people being drawn in to radical ideology. You can't live within this larger European community. You're not really part of Europe. You're part of the Ummah, the Muslim nation. You need to be doing things on behalf of the Islamic State. Very, very fast. It's important to recognize, finally, that while the Brussels attack was a wake-up for much of the world, it really wasn't the aha moment for Europe. Nor, for that matter, were the attacks in Paris in November. It might have been for the public, but not for counterterrorism officials, not for intelligence officials. That aha moment came 15 months earlier, in January 2015, not with the Charlie Hebdo attacks, which I would still consider both the Kouachi brothers, affiliated, claimed by AQAP, and Ahmed Koulibaly, self-identifying with the Islamic State, these terrorist frenemies whose groups were fighting one another tooth and nail in Syria and Iraq, engaging in attacks together in Paris. Those were still of the old school lone offender type. There was no evidence they were being foreign directed by either group. The key aha moment came a week later, in Belgium, in Verviers, where intelligence led people to a safe house based on intercepted communications. A key Belgian Islamic State terrorist based in a safe house in Athens, was on his cell phone. They raided this place. 2 Belgian officers were killed. And what they found there was tremendously disturbing. Precursor chemicals to make TATP explosives of the type that were used in Belgium this week. A large cache of weapons and ammunition, sophisticated communications gear, a significant amount of cash, and indicating to them as they continued to investigate, perhaps most disturbingly, not only that this was a foreign-directed plot, and then over the course of 2015 we had several more foreign-directed plots, including, of course, November in Paris, but also the cross-jurisdictional nature of this plot. They're in Belgium. They're being overseen by someone on a cell phone in Greece. Other pieces of the investigation were going on in Germany, in France, and in the Netherlands. A U.S. intelligence report that has since been made public presciently noted at the time that the cross-jurisdictional nature of these plots, is what is going to make them most difficult for the international community in general and for Europe in particular, given the fact that its communications and intelligence and information sharing are still very much a work in progress. This is what will make stopping the next attack all that much more difficult. We have 2 clear baskets of tasks ahead of us. The one is obviously counterterrorism, and it's what most people are going to be focused on right now. Identify the accomplices, map out the network, arrest as many people as possible who are planning attacks against the West today. And you have heard yesterday, and I'm sure there'll be more today, of further raids in Belgium, in France, etc. That shouldn't surprise, and that's appropriate. But in many ways, the larger lift, the 20-year plan, the thing that is going to be a lot harder to do is integrating communities that have become ghettoized and are not at all integrated. And I'll leave you with just one strange and disturbing statistic. I asked local police officers in Brussels if they were able to work with local imams in Brussels when they found people who were drifting off either into criminality or from criminality into radical ideologies, condoning and justifying violent extremism. And they said largely not, and for 2 reasons. One, there's not a religious but a cultural taboo that makes it very hard for them to reach out to many elements of the community. There are lots of efforts to do this, and some of the most successful, for example, have been to reach out to mothers, but they have a real problem getting past the social taboos. But in terms of the imams themselves, there are, they told me, approximately 114 imams in Brussels. Most of these young youth that are being radicalized don't speak Arabic. And most of those imams don't speak any of the 3 local languages, in particular French or Dutch. And the number they gave me, which is frankly mind-boggling, is that of the 114 imams in Brussels, a total of 8 speak local languages. So there's clearly a tremendous amount of work yet to be done. Happy to take your questions when we're done with the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you first for joining us this early. I think we all really appreciate it. The March 22nd attacks struck Europe at its political heart, as almost no news outlets failed to notice. Brussels, where most of the EU's institutions have their headquarters, actually one of the blasts was pretty close to the institutional core of the city. Of course, matters of opportunity and tactical expediency played a role in the choice of the city as a target. Brussels had been a rear base for the network that had conducted the November attacks in Paris, and ISIS operatives were already in place. Also, it seems that after the arrests in Brussels of the most wanted figure of the Paris terror ring, Sarah Abdeslam, some of the remaining members of the cell chose to kill and die rather than to be caught. But the attacks also epitomize a strategic decision by ISIS to extend its operations to Europe. Jihadi terrorists are hitting the continent hard at a time when it faces multiple crises. Such are the stakes that the future of Europe as a political project largely depends on the ability of the EU and of individual member states to respond to the threat. And this has security and political implications for the US too. Europe has become ISIS's latest battlefield. A remnant of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the group has managed to carve a self-fashioned caliphate by taking advantage of the civil war and civil unrest in Syria and Iraq. It then proclaimed outer provinces by endorsing and supporting groups in places such as Nigeria, Libya, the Sinai Peninsula, Afghanistan, etc. Now ISIS is exporting the fight to Europe with the recent attacks in Paris, in Istanbul, and in Brussels. The move might very well be partly a consequence of the setbacks that ISIS has suffered in its core Levant constituency. But that is no solace for the victims, the family of the victims, and for European citizens who are now learning to live with that threat. The whole of Europe is targeted. It's not only Istanbul, due to the proximity of the Syrian theater. It's not only Paris. It's not only Brussels. It's pretty much the whole of the continent. Networks and procurement lines spread across borders, as shown in the case of the Paris attacks. Plots have been foiled across the continent, and other cities, notably London, have been mentioned as potential targets in ISIS propaganda. EU citizens have also been targeted outside their home countries, British tourists in Tunisia or German tourists in Istanbul. Unfortunately, it is very likely that there will be more attacks, and the worst might be to come. The Brussels attackers apparently conducted surveillance operations linked to Belgium's nuclear program, and the French government officials have repeatedly warned of the prospect of terrorist chemical attacks in Europe. ISIS can rely on a potential reservoir of more than 5,000 European foreign fighters who made it at a certain point of time to the Levant. Some have come back, some are still there, some are on their way, some are dead. Not taking into account the possibility of other homegrown radicals. And when ISIS is hopefully defeated, other organizations will take up the mantle of jihad. Europe is no random target for the organization. The attacks come out at a time when the continent is facing multiple crises. A fiscal and monetary crisis that resulted in the bailout of several European states and weakened the euro, an economic crisis with sluggish growth and endemic unemployment, a migration crisis initially spurred by the Syrian civil war, with hundreds of thousands trying to reach Europe for safety, and increasingly also for economic reasons. The continent is also facing an identity crisis, questioning the status of Islam in Europe and the ability of the continent to integrate migrants. And then on top of that, a crisis of the European project, obvious since the 2005 constitutional referendums in the Netherlands and France, and now again playing out with the referendum, the Brexit referendum that is held in the UK in a couple of months. The attacks fit also within ISIS's concept of what they call the grey zone, according to the organization's publication and propaganda available online. Western Muslims find themselves in a grey zone, neither following the ways of the caliphate, as fantasized by the organization, nor fully belonging to the Western mainstream. The point through repeated terrorist attack is to provoke a political and security backlash against European Muslims, pushing them in turn to embrace the radicals. So facing that, what can Europeans do? Europe is frankly not well equipped to stand up to the threat. Just as the monetary union was created without a complementary fiscal union, free movement within Europe was established without strong security cooperation, both among member states and on the EU's external borders. The EU did devise a common security and defense policy and conducted successful operations within that framework, like the anti-piracy operation Atalanta near the coast of Somalia. But that instrument was tailored to stabilize the EU's neighborhood, typically in the Balkans, or to help solve crises even further, typically in Africa, not to defend Europe proper. A series of steps can be taken in the short term, and some are in the pipe already. As Matthew noted, there's need for increased intelligence sharing, notably in the framework of Europol. Europe needs to reinforce controls on its external borders by giving a more robust mandate to the EU's border agency, Frontex, and allowing for systematic control through revision of the Schengen border code, which is under discussion in the EU, will be under discussion in the EU Parliament soon. Also, such devices as the passenger names records for the continent, allowing member states to share crucial data about air travel, can help face the current intelligence and security cooperation challenges. More can be done also in terms of covering anonymous means of payment, including means of payment with much more limited sums than in traditional terrorist ventures. But internal and external security cannot be separated anymore. Only a handful of European countries do meet their NATO defense spending commitments right now, at least only 5 of them. Even fewer are actually willing to commit troops and resources to operations. An attempt to enlarge, to improve the burden sharing of the continent's security has been made after the Paris attacks. The French government has called on other partner states to work within the framework of a mutual assistance clause that is part of the European treaties. More can still be done. These efforts should be pursued and deepened. The new security and foreign strategy and foreign policy strategy that the EU is due to adopt in the course of the summer should reflect those priorities. Today, the future of the EU depends on its ability to deliver security to its citizens. That also requires asserting Europe's values with confidence and making sure that these do not remain empty promises for those who do choose to embrace the European way of life. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Eric.
Thank you very much to the Washington Institute for hosting this event and for inviting me to join and to sort of be able to share some thoughts on a topic that is receiving obviously enormous amounts of attention from the policy and the practitioner community. I think you open up the New York Times, Washington Post every day, and there are 3 more op-eds about what Europe should be doing, what the U.S. should be doing, what went wrong, and how to fix the problem. So it's very difficult to add, and particularly following these 2 speakers, to add much value, but I'll do my best, reflecting a bit on my the 6 years I just spent in the State Department working on some of these issues, and other experiences I've had. So I think the first point is I very much share Matt's assessment of the two-pronged challenge, which is both the counterterrorism challenge and as well as a what he described as a social inclusion challenge. I would frame it slightly differently in terms of a near-term counterterrorism challenge and a longer-term prevention challenge. And at the core of the prevention challenge is these issues of social inclusion. And one of the main issues that we have to grapple with, and Europe's been grappling with for some time, and we grapple with the United States, is resources. And every single leader will talk about the need to focus on the long term while also focusing on the short term, and not to, the goal should be, of course, to take terrorists off the battlefield and the streets, but also to diminish the pool of recruits so that there aren't, for each one you take off the street, there are not 10 more to replace that individual. Unfortunately, the resources allocation never matches that rhetoric. And we're guilty of it in the United States in terms of, I think, until very recently, until the last budget of this administration, I don't believe there were any dedicated resources for countering violent extremism at home. I think there'll now finally be budgets in the Department of Justice and Homeland Security budgets for this specific purpose. I think a similar issue confronts Belgium and other countries. The resources simply are not being allocated to prevention. So that means the kinds of mother schools that you've seen popping up around the world to engage mothers proactively and to allow them to engage their children and their other young people in the community, to set up hotlines for mothers to reach out to when they see early signs of radicalization, to train school teachers, to train police, All the rhetoric is there. In fact, the European Union has perhaps the most elaborate radicalization awareness network imaginable, and they promote it all the time, and it produces lots of thick reports and thick analyses, and they do lots of workshops around Europe. But at the end of the day, you don't see that translating into resources at the municipal level being allocated to implement the good practices that are being identified. And so that's, again, it doesn't get a lot of attention in the how to fix the problem bucket, but over the long term, a greater investment in prevention resources, I think, has to be made a priority. And if one just looks at the budgets of in the European Commission and the Development Commission, they've just announced a 1.8 billion euro fund to deal with counter-radicalization and counter-migration in Africa. 1.8 billion euros. Obviously, a similar amount of money is not being invested in counter-radicalization at home. So again, something to look at. And again, the United States is not necessarily a role model in this one yet, although hopefully it will become one. The second issue I think that needs attention is the gaps in the European Union's system. The shortcomings in the European Union architecture are not new. They've long existed in terms of the counterterrorism structures. And terrorist attacks since 9/11 in Europe are not new. They've been horrific attacks in numerous countries around the continent, and yet we haven't seen the kinds of changes in the system, in the European architecture, that I think a number of European countries have been advocating for, and certainly the United States, when I was in the government, we were advocating for. Part of the reason we haven't seen that kind of change is because, in some sense, it's the lowest common denominator process within the European Union. And so you have a number of countries that are less willing to invest resources and political will in the kinds of reforms that are so clearly needed. Europe is not without the European Union is not without its counterterrorism-related structures. They exist. They just don't work. And so the question is, by creating new structures, as has been advocated both, I think, today and in various newspapers over the last few days, the structures are great, but it has to come with political will. And it remains to be seen. I mean, I hope the political will be there to actually not only design improved structures, for example, a counterterrorism agency that's been proposed, a EU intelligence sharing mechanism that actually works, but then it has to be implemented at the national level. And that, as illustrated by either, I forgot, Matt or Olivier, when only 5 countries are submitting names to the Europol database within Europe, and it means 23 aren't, is a new structure going to change the way European governments operate? And part of the challenge here, and this again, I think we're going to see shifts in, just like we're seeing shifts in the Schengen system. I think we're going to see shifts in how European governments and institutions balance privacy and security concerns. I think for too long there has been great emphasis placed on, perhaps too much emphasis placed on privacy rights that has actually interfered with the ability of some European governments and the European Union to provide security to its citizens. So I think that debate is a very fulsome one. It's an intra-European debate that has to happen, but I think the debate is so complex that often slows down reform efforts, because there's so many stakeholders within the European system that need to be heard. It just elongates any reform process. So that's another thing to keep an eye out for. And then one thing that's always I've always scratched my head about is the challenge that the U.S. government has in terms of dialoguing with the European Union on counterterrorism. And part of that challenge is a result of the hydra-headed system within the European Union. So you have the Justice and Home Affairs process with our departments of Justice and Homeland Security. You have a foreign affairs counterterrorism dialogue. You have a terrorist financing dialogue. You have a countering violent extremism dialogue with the United States. So it's like 5 or 6 dialogues none of which involve the EU counterterrorism coordinator, because currently he really doesn't have any authority. He has a grand title and he produces wonderful reports, but he has a limited mandate and no resources to actually do anything. So these are all things that I think people have identified for the last shortcomings that have been identified for the last few years, but have really not. We haven't seen sufficient progress made there. And then two more points. The first is that as we look at the solutions or improvements in counterterrorism in Europe, a lot of it's going to involve subnational actors. A lot of it's going to involve empowering municipalities, local police forces, and resourcing them and the like. And again, it's difficult at the national level for the U.S. government to have a real influence on how national governments in Europe engage with their subnational authorities. But I think what we were trying to do when I was in the government, is to encourage as many, for example, city-to-city exchanges between European cities and U.S. cities on issues around social cohesion, countering violent extremism, so that lessons learned in the United States could be shared with cities in Europe and vice versa. One very sort of relatively well-known example of this was an exchange between Columbus, Ohio, and the city of Vilvoorde in Belgium. Vilvoorde is just outside of Brussels. And the Vilvoorde had, I think, the highest per capita number of foreign fighters who went off for any city in Europe that went off to Iraq and Syria. And a group of Vilvoordian officials came over to Columbus and other cities in the U.S. and met with cities that had designed local countering violent extremism programs that involve police, religious leaders, social workers, educators at the local level, and how they can all work together in engaging individuals at risk and creating, preventing folks from becoming further radicalized or going off to fight. And some of those lessons learned were then implemented in Vilvoorde, and the mayor apparently cited a dramatic decrease in individuals leaving. I mean, the correlation, it's hard to prove as a direct correlation, but there's certainly more of that has to happen, and that's something I think the U.S. government is trying to encourage. And then the final point I would just make is that the tendency to in this context to cite number of new security officials, a number of new police officers, dollar figure investments in security as sort of the answer to the problem in response to these situations. And this are tougher laws. And what's happened as you sort of reflect back over the last 15 years since 9/11 is in the years after 9/11, there was not one day when the U.S. wasn't being reminded by our European friends about the need to safeguard human rights as we deal with an egregious response to an egregious attack on our homeland. In every international fora, it was the Europeans who were the championing of this human rights agenda. In every European forum, it was the Europeans who were sort of reminding the U.S. of not to overreach. And we in the U.S., I think, learned our lessons about that in terms of overreach, and we've made some adjustments and sort of implemented some lessons learned. But as I watch this from afar in Europe, the debate is completely different now. With Europe understandably it's under attack, feeling directly threatened in a way they weren't perhaps right after 9/11. You've seen a significant decrease in the sort of the human rights rhetoric, and it's just something to keep an eye out for, because I think there's a risk that whether it's the sort of the emergency laws in France that have been enacted and I believe are being incorporated into the Constitution now in terms of the ability of the government to do that. I think there's a risk in overreacting. And I think there is a way to balance these concerns, both rhetorically but also practically. And I think over time, again, this is a debate that has to take place in Europe, but over time, I think there'll be a more of a balanced approach so that we don't actually create more radicalized individuals as we try to prevent them from becoming radicalized. So I will leave with that, and I'll be happy to answer any questions after. Thank you.
Now comes my favorite moment, which is I get to ask the first question. And listening to you all, I was getting more and more mystified as to why Europe has so much of a worse problem than the United States. I hear talk about social integration and social inclusion, and frankly, I had thought that it was the United States that had a considerable problem of dissatisfied youth and criminal gangs. As we've certainly seen over the last year, lots of that kind of problem. I was hearing about the lack of government coordination and agencies that don't talk to each other. I thought it was the United States with our system, which leaves policing in the hands of localities, that faces a problem. And I've even heard rumors that the FBI and the New York Police Department don't always get along the best. And I was hearing about counter-radicalization efforts, and as one of our speakers put it, the United States is not exactly a model to be followed in these areas. And I was hearing about ISIS's targeting strategy of going after people living in the so-called gray zone, and I would have certainly thought that IS would be interested in targeting the United States. So colleagues, persuade me that it's something other than sheer luck, which explains why it is that the United States has faced less of a problem in the last year from these sorts of attacks.
Well, we've had our share of cases. There are cases going on in every FBI field office, and that should be expected to continue. The vast majority of those are of the inspired, homegrown, radicalized lone offender. And what we're seeing in Europe is a shift. These are, of course, not mutually exclusive, but a shift towards these far more capable, sophisticated, dangerous foreign-directed plots. And there are several reasons for this. One is geography. Europe is at the doorstep of the conflict in Syria and Iraq, and the ability to travel, and the cost of travel, the disincentives, the barriers to entry that have been removed because of social media really puts Europe at the right at the back door, or maybe the front door of what's going on. And we are farther distance away. It is a little more expensive to go. We have plenty of people who have gone or have tried to go. But the flip side is that Europe does not have what we in the United States have put in place here since 9/11, which is a far, far more robust and integrated intelligence law enforcement coordination system. So we have fusion centers around the country to integrate local, state, and federal law enforcement. We have joint terrorism task forces led by the FBI, but with participation across the interagency. Some of the biggest cases we've had have been run by joint terrorism task force officers who are state police officers, for example. There's no such thing as a 100% success rate, and it's impossible to say there won't be a successful attack here. But we have a completely different model here that Europe now is just beginning to try and emulate. And finally, we do have a much better record at integration. You will not find in the United States a community like Molenbeek or communities like you'll find in Marseille or elsewhere that are completely insulated and in some ways isolated. Large segments of the community not speaking the local language, not sending their children to the school. You will not find a whole lot of imams in this country who don't speak the local language. We've had pockets where we've seen issues, for example, in the Somali American community in Minneapolis and in Colombia, nothing like what we saw in Europe, and that raised awareness, and there was a tremendous amount of investment. And finally, as Eric pointed out, we now have this new effort, a task force on countering violent extremism to be headquartered at the Department of Homeland Security with a deputy from the Department of Justice, and interagency participation not only across the intelligence and law enforcement spectrum, but maybe much more importantly, across the social service spectrum of government, HHS, and Department of Education, et cetera. And I think the first thing that we should expect from that task force that will be of significant import is highlighting communities where there still are either pockets of hotspots, which does not mean a terrorism hotspot, but a hotspot of communities that are not yet fully integrated. And we'll be looking to do that not only from a prevention perspective, but also from a social cohesion perspective, right? The melting pot of the United States. You don't need to check the identity, the national identity that you came from at the door to become what we all are, which is hyphenated Americans. We all, or almost all of us, came from someplace else. And I'll finally say that the Europeans are just getting on top of this. The Belgians, for example, they now have only fairly recently a coordinated unit for threat analysis, a CUTA, which is supposed to be kind of a national model fusion center, sort of based on what we have across the country between their two intelligence services and their federal police at the high national level. And we can't forget, by the way, that the high national level in Belgium is made much, much more complicated by the multiple federal ways in which that system operates, not just politically, but geographically, linguistically, and culturally. 20 bonus points to whoever can tell me how many parliaments there are in Belgium. It's more than one. And then working down to the local level where there are multiple task forces, usually one per municipality, sometimes more if they're large. So they're trying to copy that, but as Eric said, there's not enough investment. So for example, in the municipality of Molenbeek, and I don't mean to just harp on that, but I was just there, and it really is come up in almost every of the recent terrorism cases. In the municipality of Molenbeek, they have had until November, the November attacks in Paris, they had 185 open, unfilled police officer slots. After the November attacks in Paris, they got 50 new officers. That's great. They're now down 135. Part of that is funding, by the way. Part of that is that it's hard to get people to want to work in a place where there's a lot of work to be done like that. But clearly there needs to be a focus and a push into that space.
Anybody else?
Go ahead.
No, I think one of the differences with the US is that you have very destitute neighborhoods in the US where people are facing economic woes, unemployment, discrimination, etc. But in Europe, you have that overlapping in some areas with Salafism, with radical predication, and that creates a more dangerous situation. But there's also something I'd like to make clear. It's not them and us. I mean, these young people are our youth. Many of them are third generations. In France, a third of those who actually join ISIS are converts. And they don't convert to Islam and then get radicalized. They convert to ISIS directly. Yeah. So this is the challenge we're facing. It's not Europe against Islam or against Muslim, not only because that would mean falling into the trap that ISIS is laying for us, but because it's just factually not true.
I think it's a fair question. I would also just, that you asked, Patrick, but I would also note that, so we don't turn this into a what's wrong with Europe session, the United States has enormous problems with gun violence and with mass shootings that Europe doesn't have. And a lot of the inequality that is driving the situation in some of these Muslim communities in European cities, there's that inequality here. It's just manifested in a different way, and it's often not focused around Muslim communities. So I think both continents have issues of social inclusion and inequality that are generating different kinds of reactions. But I think, and secondly, I would just note that while we sort of unintentionally pile on Brussels and Belgium as sort of they have to get their act together, there are many parts of Europe at the national and local level that do have their acts together. And I think particularly at the community level, you've seen a number of, whether it's in Denmark or the Netherlands or Norway, you've seen really innovative community level programs that are dealing with exactly the kinds of challenges that Molenbeek's dealing with. The question I'm always asking myself is, given all these networks in Europe to share experiences across Europe, given all the resources that the Home Commission and the Justice Affairs Commission have, why aren't some of these programs being brought to places like Molenbeek and resourced. I don't know enough about what's preventing this from happening, but it seems like such an obvious transfer of expertise that and experience that should be happening that isn't.
Well, thank you. And surprise, surprise, there's some questions. So let's start it in back. And please wait for the microphone. Don't forget our audience watching on C-SPAN. They can't hear you no matter how loud you speak.
Good morning. Pat Byrne. I'm the Europol Senior Representative in the United States. Thank you very much for your comments. I just want to make a couple of comments and then I'll come straight to a question, if I may. The first thing I'd like to do is, as an EU representative, acknowledge the victims of the Brussels attacks and their families who are all going through suffering. In fact, one of our own Europol colleagues was injured in one of the attacks, slightly, but injured. So we must remember the victims when we talk about this subject. Secondly, I do want to say, and many of the panel have referred to it, a big difference between Europe and the United States is we are not the United States of Europe. The EU is an economic union and an economic journey. So we do have all the challenges referred to. But the solution cannot be compared to solutions found in the US, which is what I'll come to with my question. But I'm very happy to say that on law enforcement, the US is a strong supporter of the EU. I can give one figure in Siena connections alone with our US entities. There was a 63% increase in information exchange with the US agents in our headquarters, of which we have 10 federal agencies, 10 US agencies. My question comes to this. The US learned a lot post 9/11. They acknowledged intelligence failures which probably could have prevented the attacks if there was a unified response, and it led to the establishment of the NCTC. So to the panel who have all referred to it, we're now tasked with setting up the European Counterterrorism Centre in a somewhat different environment on the background that we're not the United States of Europe. But has the panel any ideas on one or two key events that made the NCTC a success? There's 18,400 law enforcement entities in the United States, but NCTC seems to have been a success in coordinating terrorist information and counterterrorism activities. So is there any advice the panel have as we move forward setting up the European Counterterrorism Centre?
Sure. First of all, thank you for mentioning the victims. It goes without saying that we have to be thinking of them, of course. Look, it's not just the NCTC that was created. We had a massive bureaucracy that was created, including the Department of Homeland Security. And I think it's important to highlight that there is this kind of broad bureaucracy that we've put in place with redundancy to be able to make sure that no one system failure will lead to catastrophe. I think that one of the most important things, especially as you're highlighting the large number of local law enforcement agencies we have here in the United States, and then think of that even more so as you get to all the local law enforcement agencies across Europe, but that are in different national spaces, is the fusion centers, which don't get as much attention as NCTC or the Joint Terrorism Task Forces. But as you go out to the fusion centers, that's where the information is pushed all the way down the pipeline to the people who are walking the streets, the law enforcement, local law enforcement agencies, the police, the people who are doing community policing that is going to have not only the law enforcement, but the prevention component that's so important. They're much, much more staffed than any FBI field office. That's what's really important. Again, we're piling on Belgium because it's happened here, but let's recognize that Belgium has put in place a lot of good changes. The fact that most of these are only the past 18 months means these things take a little bit of time to settle in, as they did here in the United States after 9/11. This fusion center between the national and the local, that's important. 18 measures that were taken after January 2015, another 12 after November. We need to give these things time to work. But again, staffing is important. So in Molenbeek, you have, I think, a really ingenious model. There is a police entity that is dealing with counter-radicalization, not to go and arrest people, but to integrate people into the community, what we would call community policing. It's a very small unit. Molenbeek has 100,000 people. 8 to 10,000 people going in and out, moving in and out every year, so a highly transient community. Second poorest community municipality in Brussels, second youngest by demographic. And while they have this really unique feature of these community police officers focusing on counter-radicalization, after they got more officers after the November attacks in Paris, they are now a total of 8. And there are 3 people in the civilian prevention branch working for the municipality. They're doing great work, but that's 11 people. So we need to staff these up and then create multiple redundant ways for communication amongst and between them. And that was most obvious now in terms of the fact that reportedly the Turks informed both the Belgians and the Dutch about one of the individuals who was then a bomber on Tuesday, because he was a Belgian national returning from Turkey to the Netherlands, and that fell through the system. And according to a Belgian minister, that was, as he put it, because of a liaison officer. Well, you need redundancy. We had that in 9/11. You can't have one person whose job it is to share the most critical piece of information, because that may not happen for any one of a number of reasons.
I would just add, in terms of a recommendation, less on the information sharing and more narrowly intelligence sharing. It's on the strategy development and strategy implementation and sort of monitoring implementation role that the RNCTC plays that I think is very, very valuable. So, and I think Europe, just like the United States, produces lots of, at the highest level, produces lots of strategy documents, lots of policy documents in response to various threats and proposing, mandating certain reforms in systems, in cooperation, and very rarely, I think, is there a really rigorous implementation plan that is both developed and then assessed. And those that are not, whether in the U.S. it's the domestic agencies that are not following through, they're held accountable in some way. I think something similar like that in the new agency might be of interest. And I would just, while I have the floor, I just want to make one comment, which is a lot of these issues of social inclusion that we're talking about in Europe and in Belgium, in particular in Molenbeek, more particularly, are not unique to Europe in the context of the counter-ISIL effort, and that there are a number of countries that are sending or are source countries for foreign fighters where those individuals are coming from marginalized communities. And the issues that we've talked about today a lot in terms of the community engagement, ensuring that governments are responsive to the needs of all of their citizens, is actually missing often from the discourse about how we deal with ISIL. And there are issues of, obviously the military issue, the intelligence sharing, the humanitarian relief, all those issues and the counter-messaging issues are all get a lot of attention. But governance questions, which I think are fundamental to this problem set, are often treated in a completely separate context. And I think at some point we have to figure out how to integrate these two key pieces. It's challenging, but I think over the long term, unless we do that in a more robust, dynamic way, we're going to continue to be focusing heavily on the short-term responses and leaving these longer-term governance challenges to a completely different set of stakeholders, and therefore undermining our effort to actually solve the problem.
Also, just one thing I'd like to add: counterterrorism is at one very end of the spectrum. But even within the realm of security, I mean, there's an issue that's becoming more and more obvious with the last few attacks and networks. Is ordinary crime. Many of the recent terrorists have actually a past in either petty crime or organized crime, and this seems to be increasingly a pathway to terrorism, once sanctified by the blessing of a radical ideology. So this is also something that needs to tackle, and by the way, which can only improve the situation of some of the neighborhoods we're talking about.
Thank you. Here, Dan.
Dan Raviv of CBS News. Would you just comment, please, on the choice of targets? On the one hand, in the United States, say the Boston Marathon bombing 3 years ago, then San Bernardino, California 3 months ago, Boston Marathon, a high-profile place, that one office party in California, almost meaningless, yet 14 people were killed. And what's the European decision? Airports, train systems, is that the routine choice for terrorists when organizations send them and give them orders?
I do think what we're seeing in part is the difference between lone offender attacks and foreign-directed attacks. In the United States, both the Boston Marathon bombing plots, and I served as an expert witness in that case, and the San Bernardino shootings were plotted by the individuals themselves, and they hit targets that were nearby and familiar to them. And in Europe, we're seeing foreign-directed plots where the idea is to inflict maximum damage, sometimes on transportation, which is an obvious target now. As Olivier said, we now know that there's surveillance that was being done on at least one senior official in the Belgian nuclear program. But not just. We saw it in November in Paris, the idea of another type of sophisticated, spectacular attack, which is more the Mumbai style. Multiple cells with firearms and some explosives. I think the big difference we're seeing is three things: foreign-directed, multiple and simultaneous attacks, including the use of explosives and in particular suicide bombings, which we hadn't seen before, and plots that are multi-jurisdictional in nature. In November, people from Belgium and in Belgium were plotting attacks in France. And here we have again in Verveers multiple lines of investigation well beyond Belgium. We're going to see that, I'm sure, in the investigation into the attacks this week in Brussels. When the European Union, when Europol is reporting that there are 5,000 verified European Union citizens who have traveled to Syria and Iraq, and we have all kinds of unverified reports of how many of them have come home, the one thing we know is that there is a credible threat and there is an intelligence gap in terms of knowing all the people who have gone, and once they've gone, have they returned and where are they? We've seen that as a really important gap in terms of being able to police the borders overall. So there's a lot of work to be done, but I think we are seeing the difference between lone offender and foreign-directed attacks.
And down here in front, please.
Thank you. Lieutenant Colonel Wowska from the Polish Embassy. I'd like to ask you two questions. First is, we know that the attacks in Europe are somehow directed. How can we trace the masterminds? You were saying about imams, they don't speak local languages, so it's not the major source of radicalization. Must be internet, social media, and so on. So how to improve tracing the masterminds? That's the first question. And second, regarding the Europe. France has asked European Union to assist, or European countries to assist after Paris attacks. What's the practical dimension, how it really, developed? And do you think there's a danger for Schengen? And my comment, don't please, I think the link between NATO, this 2% spending as a military, that 5 countries are spending 2% of their budget on the defense-related issue, is very loosely linked with counterterrorism, counter-radicalism. So this money will not be definitely spent on let's say, issues regarding the counterterrorism or counter-radicalism. Thank you.
Okay, I'll leave that one mostly for Olivier. I'll just say that it would be spent theoretically on taking the fight to the Islamic State. And so there are there's lines of connectivity, there's tissue connecting all of these issues. None of these should be siloed. Counter-radicalization in your community, going all the way back to the fact that there is something calling itself, it's not actually but a state, nor is it actually Islamic. As Olivier said, people who are converting are not converting to Islam, they're converting to Islamic Stateism. On tracking the masterminds, the biggest piece here, of course, is going to be intelligence. That we were able to know about the Verveers plot because of intercepted communications. That individual then bragged in the Islamic State's propaganda magazine, Molenbeek, about how easily he was able to move in and out of Europe, despite the fact that he was wanted. And so it's going to be not just intelligence, but law enforcement issues as well. I want to challenge the idea, though, that surely the driver of radicalization is primarily or only the internet or social media. That's playing a huge component, but we are seeing in almost every case face-to-face radicalization. And it's not the imams, you're right, it's other people in the neighborhood. The vast majority of mosques in Molenbeek are storefront mosques. A storefront mosque in and of itself isn't necessarily bad, but to the extent it is unregulated and outside the scope of the rest of society, there are some risks, and it won't necessarily be in the mosque itself. Again, this nexus with criminality is huge. There's one individual who's now in prison in Belgium who was a key radicalizer in Molenbeek. He was nicknamed Papa Noel because he said, continue to go out and do your criminal activity. Just give me a portion of it so that we together can finance the foreign terrorist travel of those who want to go. In another case reported recently by Politico, a journalist was talking to officials in Belgium who told him of an intercepted communication they had between Belgians in Molenbeek and Belgians in Syria. And the guys in Syria wanted to know, one of the previous bombers, how are the guys in the street referring to him? Are they referring to him as a martyr? Are they referring to him as a bum? And the reason they explain they're asking is because for these guys, it's about street cred. Right? It's about going from zero to hero. It's not actually about, the highest levels of paradise.
About the NATO issue, and thank you for asking the question. Poland is, by the way, one of those countries who meet their commitment, and one of the most serious countries when it comes to defense issues in Europe. The 2% of GNP spending target is not spending on NATO. It's spending on the military, generally speaking. So it's acquiring capabilities that can be used within NATO, within the EU, or on a national basis. And this is indeed useful in the situation we're facing. Because some of those capabilities are used to actually target the Islamic State in its Iraqi and Syrian strongholds through the air raids that are conducted by the coalition. And second, increasingly, and that's the case in Belgium nowadays, that's been the case in France for more than a year, troops are deployed on the streets to assist and support the police in trying to secure. Soldiers are protecting mosques and synagogues and churches. Are patrolling airports and train stations. So the more you have to make sure you have a military that's able to conduct various missions, including increasingly domestic missions, unfortunately, the better you're equipped to face this threat, both individually and collectively. So that's why I referred to that 2% threshold. The other part of your question about the French authorities invoking Article 42.7 in the EU treaties. Well, we have had the idea was that France was taking a lot of the burden of defending the continent, including through the operation the French military is conducting in Mali and the Sahel. Targeting another brand of jihadis linked to Al-Qaeda, but who are still a threat to Europe and elsewhere. We did get contributions from other member states to different operations in those theater, both in the Sahel region of Africa and also the international coalition operations in Iraq and Syria. For some of those contributors, there was a significant political change, and I'm thinking in particular of Germany, which is traditionally more cautious about those deployments. But those threats are enduring, so the burden sharing is I think to be pursued. Last of your point was Schengen. Well, Schengen is facing two challenges. Schengen is the free movement space among a certain number, a majority of EU member states, not all of them. For instance, the UK and Ireland are not part of the Schengen space. Schengen is now facing two main challenges. One is the massive flow of refugees into Europe. And the second is the possibility that free movement offers to terrorists to move from one country to another and to organize networks across borders. And the obvious response to that is to try and reinforce the EU's external borders and control capabilities. But that is something politically extremely significant. I mean, Schengen is one of the most tangible benefits of the EU for European citizens, the fact that you can cross a border without being stopped, the fact that you can buy chocolate in Belgium coming from Dunkirk without stopping at the border, which wasn't the case when I was a kid. Unfortunately, terrorists use the same possibilities to do other things, but safeguarding that and reinforcing that in order to cope with security challenges is not only a security issue, it's a major political issue. It's one of the most tangible, visible, and economically profitable achievements of the EU.
Yeah, I just want to add one comment on the question about how to trace masterminds, and I think there's obviously all the communications tracking and the intelligence gathering that is essential, but I think another piece is the role that community members play in reporting early signs of radicalization and then trying to help intervene against them. And it's not necessarily by reporting to the police, which may not be seen as a friend of the community, but reporting through another channel. And I don't think it's a secret that Abdeslam was able to, I don't know if the right term is hide out, but find a little bit of safe haven in his home community in Molenbeek. Again, I don't know if it's been proven, but I assume there are people in the community who knew he was there and could potentially have notified government officials of one sort of his presence and perhaps his plans. But I don't think, again, the investments in that piece of the information gathering and is there. So even if one way is to go about sort of getting rid of the masterminds, but then the other way is to go about, and they're equally important, getting rid of the recruits, because a mastermind needs people to actually implement his or her master plan.
Dan down here in front.
Just wait for a mic.
Behind you.
Dan DeLuce from Foreign Policy. Thank you. A couple questions. To what degree, what role does the sanctuary in Syria and Iraq for Islamic State play in this terrorism we're seeing in Europe? Because you're describing these kind of indigenous problems inside Europe in these communities. What degree is the sanctuary feeding the problem? And then you were talking about privacy considerations and privacy laws. To what degree are privacy laws and regulations in Europe a barrier, that actually laws have to be changed to allow the kind of intelligence and gathering and eavesdropping necessary to track the extremists?
I'll take the first question, and I might have to punt on the second because I'm not an expert in the specific European privacy laws, but I'll take a stab at that as well. In terms of the sanctuary in Syria feeding the problems in Europe, I think even when there's a political solution in Syria, you're going to have thousands of fighters who've gone off to fight in Syria and Iraq. They'll be either dead, they'll be wanting to remain in Syria, or they'll want to go home. And thousands will probably want to go home, having renounced and be willing to renounce violence. And the challenge, I think, for Europe is going to be what to do with this influx of returnees and how to decide whether to prosecute or reintegrate them into society. And I think just like the system in Belgium is overwhelmed by simply tracking the 100+ suspected terrorists that are in the midst, it'll be overwhelmed by how to handle the returnees. And I think in terms of just being able to do rigorous intake in terms of deciding which ones are threats to society, which ones should be prosecuted, which ones are sort of able to be reintegrated, and developing programs for reintegration. And I think this gets to the question our colleague from Europol asked about what the European Counterterrorism Center could usefully do. And this isn't a lesson learned from NCTC, but this might be nevertheless a valuable piece of what this new agency could do, which is be a centralized place for dealing with returnees. And because a lot of individual governments may not have the resources to rigorously vet the returnees and then develop programs for reintegration where appropriate. I think maybe a centralized European funded outpost could do the trick. But the bottom line is I don't think the resolution in Syria is going to end the problem. I think it'll certainly immediately, it'll certainly, I think, slow it down because there'll no longer be that attraction for fighters going off to Syria and to get trained. But I do think sort of the cat's out of the bag in the sense of there are thousands of people who've gone off and that they've been trained, they've been exposed to horrific violence, and how we deal with their reintegration or return is a huge challenge. On the privacy issue,
If I may put in a corollary question, though, there are close to 1 million people who fled Syria who have come into Europe. Could you talk about to what extent you think that's going to be part of the problem here? And also, you were referring to the ease and low cost of travel from the Middle East, all three of you were, as part of the reason why Europe faces a greater challenge than the United States does. To what extent are tight restrictions on travel from these countries appropriate? We've heard quite a discussion about that matter in the U.S. presidential debates.
That doesn't make them smart questions. Why don't we finish dealing with these two sets of questions, and then we'll add on an answer to this third, where it's a whole separate issue. But why don't you finish what you were going to answer here? And so this is
on the privacy question. Again, it's a field unto itself, so I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in privacy law, let alone European privacy law. However, I have seen the passenger name recognition issue and discussions within Europe about how whether EU member states are going to be required to gather personal data from airlines of the passengers flying in and out of into European Union airports, and the real roadblocks that certain constituencies in Europe place to creating this database, a database that exists in the United States, and it was constantly it's the right to privacy and the right to protect individual information, and sort of this again it's a understandable reaction to what happened in East Germany and elsewhere in terms of government gathering all this data on individuals and who knows what they do with it, but that created an enormous roadblock to progress in that negotiation that was in the aftermath of various terrorist attacks and terrorist threats and foiled attacks. For example, the underwear bomber in 2009, I believe, was one of the impetuses. The reaction to that was one of the impetuses for U.S. pushing Europe to intensify progress on the PNR issue. And so we still haven't. I still don't believe there is a PNR agreement within the European Union because of these, in part because of these privacy concerns. But my information may be outdated. And then, of course, individual member states have their own privacy laws that have to be. So once you get a European Union level agreement, each European Union country has to implement that agreement, and different national approaches and different national experiences may further complicate that. So I can't speak specifically about the laws, but I do know that privacy rights are constantly an issue in terms of information gathering and sharing within the European system. So, but maybe Matt has more.
I'll just add on the first issue of the sanctuary issue. One thing to point out is actually we are making it more difficult for people to travel to Syria and Iraq. We've had some success there. Success sometimes breeds other challenges, and so we're seeing people now moving to Libya, and that will present some other challenges. I do think that the sanctuary provides both assistance to the ideology. There's this ideology of success, and there's nothing like battlefield defeat to push back on their ability to radicalize and recruit people to this purported idyllic Islamic State. And because, by the way, we have had battlefield defeat, reportedly 20% territory pushback in Syria and 40% in Iraq, it's logical that they will become more ultra-violent at home and become still more determined to strike at us in our homes via asymmetric warfare, which is the only real way they can fight us with any effectiveness. And that plays into the other role of sanctuary, which is they, in these foreign-directed plots, not everyone, but a significant number of the individuals are people who did go to Syria and Iraq. In one case, someone who had gone for only 6 days, but you only need a few days to learn how to do certain types of skills, and they are in fact coming back with greater skill for particular types of attack. In terms of what to do with the returning foreign fighters, one thing that people mentioned to me last week is there's an effort, for example, within the EU Counterterrorism Office and Europol both, to help member states be able to put together procedures for the use of internet evidence, for example, which has become much more important. When you can prosecute, they want to prosecute, I was told, but at the end of the day, many of those people won't be prosecutable. Those who are probably not going to, in the European context, get anything near life terms. And so whether it's immediate or in a few years, you're going to have to think about rehabilitation, about the returnees, and that's a huge issue. On the sidelines of the White House CVE Summit, we hosted here at the Washington Institute an event on the issue of rehabilitation of foreign fighters with the mayor of our house and a U.S. Retired general who was involved in these types of things in the prison system in Iraq back in the coalition war, and Gilles de Kerkhove, the EU Counterterrorism Coordinator. And if you're interested in that type of an issue, that's on our website, washingtoninstitute.org. And I'll finally say, on the privacy issue, watch for change. I'll give you just one example. Prior to Tuesday's attack, again, the EU Counterterrorism Coordinator's last report had some really interesting things in it. As a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury overseeing some of the financial intelligence activities, I was particularly interested in this piece. You may recall that we had some sensitive negotiations at one point with the Europeans over the Terror Finance Tracking Program, a program that still is in effect and to great effect. It took some time for the European Parliament to get on board in terms of being able to feel comfortable with its privacy concerns, and those are legitimate. And we got there, and it's able to function. But there were some cutouts. So today you do not have the United States going to the Europeans and saying, you got to remove these cutouts. It's the European Union Counterterrorism Coordinator who's saying it. Specifically, for example, there's a cutout from the TFTP system. If you make a payment denominated in euros from somewhere in the EU to somewhere within the EU, there's a cutout. That's not covered in the SWIFT program. Washington's not telling the Europeans you need to eliminate that cutout. The European Union Counterterrorism Coordinator is telling the Europeans they need to cut out that cutout. And I think that it's not that privacy issues are not important. They are. It's not that these concerns are not legitimate. They are. It just means that we're going to have to find more sophisticated ways to balance them in ways that we all feel comfortable on the one hand and secure on the other.
Well, I think most has been said about privacy issues. I mean, that you have different views between different member states, within different member states. It is healthy that we have the debate. And it's what's going on right now, including, which is a good sign, at the level of the EU Parliament, increasingly, because some of the instruments we're discussing have to be passed by the EU Parliament. Syria and Iraq, yes, it would be extremely beneficial to defeat the Islamic State there, because these are training grounds for fighters. This is where most of their command and control infrastructure is. And it also provides with a narrative. It's much more of an epic to go and fight for the caliphate and try and retake Damascus, an historic caliphate capital, rather than to blow oneself in a tube station 2 blocks away from where you grew up. Yes, definitely. So.
Matt, I'm not going to let you escape so easily the difficult question which makes us all uncomfortable, which is we recognize the humanitarian crisis of these refugees flowing, and we feel great sympathy for the refugees. But is there a counterterrorism problem? And we may feel quite unsympathetic to some of the individuals who are making proposals which don't always seem particularly well informed about restrictions on travel from those countries, but is this an issue that we need to think about? Is in fact the difficulties of getting a visa to the United States one of the reasons that we've had fewer foreign-directed terrorist attacks here in the United States?
So the simple answer is, unfortunately, there is evidence of small numbers but very, very disturbing cases of terrorists who've been able to sneak into Europe within the waves of legitimate refugees. That is something that we could contend with if we put in place some of the measures that Europol in particular is spearheading. Again, as the EU Counterterrorism report highlights, there's a problem when Europol puts in place measures and a significant number of the EU member states don't connect to it. That system is only going to be as effective as the lowest common denominator. So I don't think that we should be tarring and feathering all of the refugees. We need to recognize that, unfortunately, there have been some really disturbing and, because of the attacks, devastating instances of people being able to move within those larger waves of migration. But as we are putting in place more controls at the borders, biometrics, et cetera, if we can put these systems in place and make them actually work, we do have the capability of being able to make it much safer for Europe and not unlike we have done here in the United States. It is true. Here in the United States, if you want to get to the United States, there's multiple redundancy levels of checks. And we should be able, as the human race, to be able to accommodate people who are fleeing death and destruction in a way that doesn't present us with the kind of immediate threat that we're facing from attacks like we saw on Tuesday.
As the research director of an institute which tries to bring in people from some nationals of some of the countries concerned, I can tell you right now that many of these restrictions the U.S. government has put in place on travel by Syrian and Iraqi nationals are very much impeding our work and our ability to interact with people from those countries. So do not be mistaken about that my question implied a sympathy with that. And if I may, over here, please.
Two quick questions. First, it's become anecdotal that the Belgians actually had a law or a restriction that you could not invade a home, you could not carry out police activity between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m. Is that true? My second point would be, if talking about integration, and anybody who served or worked in Belgium, I'm a retired foreign service officer, Belgium is the least integrated country in Europe. They can't even integrate the Walloons with the Flemish and the German speakers. And the third thing is, where you're talking about Europe, and yet, was it 3 weeks ago, a major bombing attack in Istanbul, preceded a few weeks before that by a major attack in Ankara. As far as I know, the sick man of Europe, that, as the Turks will tell you, is no longer in Europe, but it certainly is a member of NATO. And that was not brought up at all today.
Three important points. The latter wasn't brought up because we're really focusing on Europe, and we could focus on other attacks around the world.
Watch it.
Well, it's not yet. It might be at some point. It's part of NATO. It's not part of the EU. There's really nothing to watch there. And if some of these press cases continue, it's unlikely that they will be. On the anecdotal piece of it, yes, it was the case that there was a ban on doing searches between certain hours, and that was removed after the November attacks in Paris. And finally, on the issue of Belgian integration, I found it tremendously interesting that in all of my meetings last week, local, federal, every level you can imagine, not a single person in their opening remarks to me said anything about the integration issues among the different communities in Belgium, about the difficulties of navigating society, except for a friend of mine, an American in Belgium, who told me parenthetically over dinner about how difficult it is if there's something going on, if there's a trash bin from the city that's blocking your driveway, how many phone calls to how many different parts and layers of government, regional, linguistic, ethnic, federal, you need to call to get that issue resolved in the neighborhood. And so it's a very important point.
Yes, so I just one remark. I think I mentioned the attacks in Istanbul twice in my initial talk, but to build on the community and divided society issue, I think we're talking a lot about community and not enough about individuals. The individuals who join ISIS do it. They do it by doing. They break with traditional Islam that their parents would practice. They break with the traditional Western environment of their own family when they're converts. And once again, they don't convert to Islam. They convert to the ISIS interpretation of Islam directly. Some individuals among those communities, and in far greater numbers than those who join terrorist organizations, join the security forces of the different European countries. And they play a key role in following and infiltrating some of those networks. So we should be careful, sometimes referring to communities only and not to individuals and individual trajectories, not only has us miss the point and what's actually at stake, but also eventually plays in favor of the more radical who claim a monopoly on defining what the community should be and should do and should be identified as, and basically on a Salafi-inspired basis, which is not what we're looking for.
Thank you. Wait for a microphone, Ed.
You know, sometimes in life one should consider briefly to consider a narrative.
Identify yourself.
The whole narrative being wrong. Italy has had 0 casualties since September 11. In Italy, on October 12th, the day before the October 13th attack in Paris, the Italian authorities arrested 17 people. One was a mistaken identity. The other 16 had both explosives and automatic weapons.
Is there a question?
This question is this.
Yeah.
The Italians have had 0 casualties since September 11. The Italians follow radically different methods than all the other European countries. For example, they have no Office of Counterterrorism. Does not exist in Italy. The Italians have 161 imams in prison. They were put in prison after they were approached by people and asked them to refer them to brothers who might be more active. Then they locked them up.
And the question?
And the question is this: how come these other jurisdictions, the French, the Belgians, and so on, don't follow the Italians? Because several European countries have now broken with the pact and have adopted the Italian method, because they do not wish to have more terrorism. So the issue is, how come you gentlemen have kept talking about these problems as if they were inevitable, impossible, that's the way it is, that's Europe. The Italians have 0 casualties. 45 Italians have died in Mali, in Bali, in New York, in Paris, in Belgium, 0 in Italy. So how come nobody pays attention to the Italian model at all? 0 attention.
In part because I'd say I would challenge the idea that there's a separate Italian model. Having spent time, you asked your question several times, so I'll answer it. Having spent time with law enforcement and intelligence in Rome, they do a great job. They're not acting alone. They're part of the European Union. There's open borders. So there's a big element of skill, and there's a big element of luck. God forbid there could be an attack in Italy tomorrow. I wouldn't be so brave as to say Italy's got it right, the rest of Europe has got it wrong. There are other countries that haven't had as many attacks there. I wouldn't say that it's a completely different model. I would also say that there are different, the nature of these communities are different in different places. The biggest thing to me in terms of Brussels, which we're focusing on because of this week's attacks, is that they have known about these communities that were not integrated for a very, very long time. It wasn't a priority. And now they're playing catch up. They could put in place and get funded the most sophisticated systems and strategies, and it will still take time. So it's thrilling and wonderful that the Italians have not had an attack domestically within Italy. May it continue. I don't think I would be as bold as you are in saying that it's not going to happen or it's because they've found the golden nugget. They're still part of the EU, and there's a lot more that even they can still do, as Italian officials told me not that long ago.
Gentlemen, a final word?
I think it's what I emphasized in my remarks, which is that is the prevention angle, and I think again we are in the United States catching up to this pretty rapidly now, and the need to invest more in prevention, whether at the national, state, or local level. And it's not just involving governments; it's involving civil society, local leaders, municipal authorities, women, imams. It's a much more horizontal effort across communities and stakeholders, and everyone talks about this. You know, you can go to any country, including Italy and including Brussels and Belgium, and they'll talk this as if they really believe it, and they probably do believe it. But the next step is to resource it, and I think that until we start doing that, and it doesn't have to be through the effort to counter terrorism. It doesn't have to be labeled a counterterrorism measure, but I do think more investment has to be made in this area, particularly, but not only in Europe. So that would be my sort of top line point.
Olivier?
Well, my last point would be to emphasize that stakes are extremely high, including for the United States and what's happening in Europe. U.S. citizens have been killed in Brussels. They can be targeted in Europe. They can be targeted from Europe. And also, if Europe doesn't succeed in being up to the task, which is a long task, some talk about a generational challenge, the U.S. might have to cope with a very different Europe, and that's something to bear in mind on this side of the pond.
Belgium doesn't have the largest number of foreign terrorist fighters, not overall, and not in Europe, but they do have the largest number per capita. And so as I think about this, for what I'd want to say for one final comment, I'd say this. One thing that's unique in Belgium and elsewhere in Europe is that while we do have cases where radical religious ideology plays a critical role, that's not what we're seeing here. What we're seeing here is that there is a religious piece, but the recruitment of criminals, this zero to hero phenomenon, is a huge problem. Officials in Brussels stressed to me multiple times in multiple meetings that there is a religious component. The quote that was people said over and over is Salafism is mainstream in Brussels, and while not every Salafist is a terrorist by any stretch of the imagination, each of the terrorists we're dealing with has been radicalized to Salafism. Maybe not, because a lot of these kids, as we said, are being radicalized to the idea of the Islamic State more than anything else. They're not praying 5 times a day. They're still drinking alcohol. It's a different type of and very, very fast hyperspeed radicalism. And then I would say that this local prevent component that Eric has pointed to is critically important. Again, the Belgians have, over the past 15 to 18 months, put things in place. They've trained up over 17,000 police officers in the types of things to look for radicalization. They've trained up over 700 teachers and social workers, people who are in the communities, to be able to identify and how to respond and how to interact. They've built platforms that meet once a week or once every other week, depending on the platform, where people in the local government with the police, with people at the federal police level, can meet and discuss things. They do have things in place. And then finally, I just would stress one last time this issue of crime. So much so that the Belgians have 2 what are now separate lists. One they call their consolidated list, which is for their security, primarily terrorism cases of, I think it's about 675 persons. And they also have a separate list they call the JIB, the JIB, the Joint Information Box, which is a parallel list primarily for people they know of in the criminal context. And because so many of these people, including Salah Abdeslam, were people that the police had to admit, yeah, we know him. We knew him as a petty criminal who was not a big criminal and certainly wasn't going to the mosque and wasn't involved in terrorism. But because they find so much overlap, they're looking to consolidate these lists, and that's probably a good idea.
Well, I'd like to thank you all for consolidating our insights on this matter, and I'm sorry to say that we'll probably be returning to the subject again in the future.